In 1846, hundreds of emigrants headed west, chasing a better life in California. They believed the journey would be difficult, but nothing prepared them for what followed. The trail stretched across thousands of miles, through deserts, rivers, and towering mountains. Then, as autumn approached, the Sierra Nevada rose directly in their path ahead. Snow began falling early, turning a difficult crossing into a desperate fight for survival. Their wagons slowed, supplies disappeared, and the mountains seemed to close around them. Every mile forward became harder, while winter quietly tightened its grip on the travelers. Some still believed they could escape before the deepest winter arrived in the mountains, but the mountains had other plans, and their route was already becoming a trap. By the time they understood the danger, turning back was no longer possible. Their progress slowed dramatically, and every obstacle demanded more strength from the exhausted travelers. The trail became narrower, steeper, and far more dangerous than anyone had expected. Behind them, miles of difficult terrain made returning almost impossible for the entire group. Ahead, the mountains waited beneath a sky that was already beginning to change. They pushed forward, unaware that a deadly decision was bringing winter closer. Then came the choice that would change the fate of everyone traveling with them. Instead of following the safer established trail, they chose a dangerous shortcut toward California. The shortcut promised to save precious miles, but it would cost them something far greater. Their wagons entered rough country where every mile forward became painfully slow. And somewhere ahead, the first signs of winter were already waiting for them. By now, the mountains were covered in snow, and the trail ahead was disappearing beneath their feet. The travelers had expected hardship, but they had not expected winter to arrive this early. Each step became slower as snow began to trap the wagons and exhaust the animals. Soon, the trail was no longer a road. It was a struggle just to move forward. Men climbed out of the wagons and began digging through the snow by hand. The storm grew stronger, burying the tracks they had just made. Then the wagons stopped moving altogether. The Donner Reed party was trapped high in the Sierra Nevada, with no easy way back. Their supplies were limited, the temperature was falling, and the mountains offered no escape. And this was only the beginning of the nightmare that would follow. As the storm continued, the travelers finally realized they were no longer simply crossing the mountains, they were trapped. Inside the cabins, families gathered around small fires, desperately trying to stay warm through the freezing nights. But warmth was becoming difficult to maintain because their supply of firewood was slowly disappearing. Then something even more frightening became obvious. Their food supplies were beginning to run dangerously low. Every meal now had to be measured carefully, because nobody knew how many weeks the winter might last. Outside, their exhausted animals struggled against the snow, while the wagons remained buried deeper with every passing storm. At night, the camp became almost completely silent, except for the wind screaming through the frozen trees. Some families began counting their remaining food, quietly wondering how long they could possibly survive. Then the leaders gathered around a table and spread out the map, searching desperately for another way forward. But the route ahead offered no easy escape, and what they discovered next would make their situation even worse. With the wagons trapped and supplies disappearing, a small group finally made a desperate decision. They would leave the camp on foot. They strapped wooden snowshoes to their feet, carried only the essentials, and stepped into the mountains, hoping to find a way through. Behind them, their families watched in silence, knowing these men were walking into a wilderness that had already defeated the entire wagon train. The climb quickly became brutal, as every step sank deep into the snow and the freezing wind made breathing increasingly difficult. Hours passed, but the mountains seemed endless. The travelers pushed forward while exhaustion slowly began taking control of their bodies. Then the weather suddenly turned worse, and a wall of snow surrounded them, destroying the trail they had been following. Somewhere ahead was the route to safety, but with visibility disappearing, they could no longer tell whether they were moving toward California or deeper into the mountains. And as the storm swallowed the trail behind them, the group faced a terrifying possibility. They might never find their way back. The storm finally began to weaken, but the men were already exhausted, freezing, and dangerously low on food. They stopped to rest on the mountainside, knowing that every hour they spent there meant another hour closer to starvation. Then, through the thinning clouds, something appeared ahead, a distant opening in the mountains. Hope returned for the first time in days. If they could reach the other side, they believed they might finally escape the Sierra Nevada. Slowly they pushed forward, descending through the snow, while the landscape began to change beneath their feet. At last, they reached a high point and looked down upon a vast valley stretching beyond the mountains. But the journey was far from over. They still had to descend the dangerous slopes and find a settlement where someone could help them. Meanwhile, news of their desperate escape was spreading among the settlers and traders farther west. Supplies were gathered, horses prepared, and men began discussing whether a rescue expedition could reach the trapped families. But nobody yet knew the most terrifying part of the story. The people still trapped behind the mountains were running out of time. At the winter camp, the remaining families watched the rescuers disappear into the mountains, carrying with them their last fragile hope. Behind them, the cabins grew quieter. Food was running dangerously low, and even the strongest settlers were beginning to weaken. Every scrap of flour, grain, and dried meat was carefully measured. Nothing could be wasted. Outside, abandoned wagons and empty equipment stood buried beneath the snow, a silent reminder of how much the journey had already cost them. The rescue party continued toward the mountains, moving slowly through deep snow with horses loaded with food, blankets, and supplies. Each step brought them closer to the trapped emigrants, but the Sierra Nevada remained a deadly barrier between them. When the rescuers finally reached the settlement, survivors gathered around them, desperate for news of their families still trapped in the mountains. Some had expected the worst, others still believed that everyone could be saved. But the rescuers knew the truth. Reaching the camp was only the beginning. They would have to lead exhausted men, women, and children back through the same frozen wilderness, and somewhere beyond those mountains, dozens of people were waiting for help. While winter continued to tighten its grip, the survivors moved deeper into the mountains, unaware of what waited ahead. Snow covered the trail, making every step slower and more dangerous. The mountains seemed endless, and their remaining strength was quickly disappearing. Behind them, the abandoned camp was slowly swallowed by falling snow. Ahead stood the Sierra Nevada, blocking their only path toward safety. Every direction looked identical, leaving the exhausted survivors dangerously lost. Their supplies were nearly gone, but turning back meant certain death. Then the trail disappeared completely beneath a massive wall of snow. For the first time, they realized they might never escape, and somewhere beyond those mountains, salvation was closer than they imagined. At last, the mountains began to fall behind them, revealing open country. The exhausted travelers descended carefully, carrying everything they could still save. With every step downward, the snow became thinner and easier to cross. Far below, the valley offered something they had almost forgotten: hope. But reaching safety would still require surviving the journey ahead. Their horses struggled forward, while exhausted families silently followed behind. As darkness approached, they stopped and gathered around a small fire. Relief parties began organizing supplies, horses, and provisions for the desperate survivors trapped in snow. Several rescuers studied maps carefully, searching for the safest routes through the dangerous mountains. Meanwhile, survivors continued struggling forward, weakened by hunger, exhaustion, and weeks of brutal winter. Deep inside the mountains, abandoned wagons remained buried beneath snow, silently marking their tragic journey. Rescue teams pushed deeper into the wilderness, following faint tracks left by desperate travelers. Their arrival finally brought food, warmth, and the first real possibility of survival. Survivors recorded their experiences afterward, preserving memories of the terrible winter for future generations. Their written accounts revealed different perspectives, leaving historians debating what truly happened inside those camps. Old photographs, diaries, and maps still preserve fragments of the Donna Reed party's tragic story. Today, the journey remains a haunting reminder of survival, desperation, and the consequences of one decision.